Now today, we deal with, at least we will try to deal with, one of the most emotionally charged and contentious conflicts in the world, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. After 11 days of fighting last month and hundreds killed and thousands injured, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire on the 21st of May. It's been 22 days since. This is a rare opportunity for the parties to step back and ask some inconvenient questions that could lead them to what they really want, what the people really want. But to get there, we need to understand the key facts in a most complex, complicated, and contentious history. So please bear with me. Under the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the British promised a Jewish national home. And right after the First World War, in 1922, the League of Nations created a new entity called Palestine, essentially Arab, which came under the British mandate. Then, during the Second World War, over 154,000 Jews entered Palestine to escape Nazi persecution, pushing up the Jewish population in Palestine from 17% in 1931 to 30% in 1935. After the war, in 1947, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of dividing Palestine into two states. One, Palestinian Arabs controlling the West Bank and Gaza, and the Jews would have essentially the coastal plain between Tel Aviv and Haifa. The following year, in 1948, the State of Israel was declared by David Ben-Gurion, who became its first prime minister. The following day, 5 Arab nations launched the first Arab-Israeli war. Israel gained the offensive eventually and ended up controlling a larger part of Palestine. Over 700,000 Palestinians became refugees. Now, most of them fled their homes voluntarily at the urging of Arab leaders who promised that all who left would return after a quick Arab victory. This was dubbed the Great Catastrophe. Almost 20 years on, in 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in response to economic and military blockades, mainly by Egypt's then President Nasser. Called the Six-Day War, Israel's swift and decisive victory led to the occupation of the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank from Jordan. 250,000 Palestinians fled as refugees. In September of 1967, at the Arab Summit in Khartoum, the Arab leaders adopted the famous 3 no's. No recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel, and no peace with Israel. A decade later, Egypt became the first Arab country to recognize Israel under the Camp David Accord, hosted by the US President Jimmy Carter. In 1982, there was the Reagan Plan. Then, in 1987, Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, agreed to recognize Israel and make peace with Israel. And possibly in retaliation of this, Hamas was formed in the same month. Its charter was unequivocal: destruction of Israel. 1993 was a milestone. Brokered by Norway, the Oslo Peace Accords were signed at the White House, hosted by US President Bill Clinton. Israel was represented by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the PLO by Chairman Yasser Arafat. A key outcome was the creation of a Palestinian Authority, which was to lead to a Palestinian state 5 years down. Through a series of negotiations between 1994 and the year 2000, Israel agreed to systematically cede control of much of the West Bank. Now, this was scuttled by the launch of the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, characterized by suicide bombings. 164 human bombs exploded in Israel, and 450 terrorists were arrested on their way to suicide missions. In 2002, Israel invades and reoccupies much of the West Bank. 500 Palestinians are killed and 8,500 are arrested. In the year 2003, the US President George Bush hosted the Middle East Peace Plan. Following up, in 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon removed the last Jewish settlement in the Gaza Strip. The following year, Hamas wins the Palestinian parliamentary elections and takes control of the Gaza Strip. US President Obama enters the fray in 2009 by bluntly repudiating Israel's settlements in the West Bank. 2 years down, he calls for negotiations to begin for a Palestinian state based on pre-1967 borders. The following year, in 2012, the UN votes to accept Palestine as a non-member observer state. Meanwhile, back home, Hamas fires 4,800 rockets and 1,700 mortars over 2 weeks. Israel strikes back. According to the UN, the total numbers killed 2,189 Palestinians and 73 Israelis. At the tail end of President Obama's term in 2016, the US, for the first time, abstains on a UN Security Council resolution that declares that the settlements by Israel have no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law. Just 3 years later, US President Trump declares that the US no longer considers the Israeli settlements illegal. The following year, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled against the Israeli law that retroactively legalized almost 4,000 Jewish settlement homes on privately owned Palestinian land in the West Bank. In May 2021, this year, the attempt by Jewish settlers to evict long-time Arab residents, Israeli police preventing Arabs from entering the Damascus Gate, and the police raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third most holy site for Muslims. These led to Palestinian protests and violent police retaliation. Hamas fired rockets into Jerusalem, and Israel responded with massive airstrikes on Gaza, resulting in significant civilian deaths. That brings us to the current ceasefire.